Today is Thursday, September 15th, what will become known as Ethereum Merge Day. And you're probably scratching your heads wondering, why is Ian still talking about Ethereum? And it is with good reason. I think we need to equip ourselves with a much better understanding of what proof of stake actually is so that we may form a better argument for why proof of work is so irreplaceable. And that is exactly what we are going to do today. Let's jump in. Welcome back to another video. My name is Ian Major. I'm an entrepreneur, Bitcoin pleb, and all-around raging capitalist. And I've been meaning to do this video for quite some time, talking about some of the potential merits, believe it or not, to something like proof of stake, but also some of the potential risks and pitfalls. And so today we're going to break down how proof of stake actually works, specifically within Ethereum. I want to make that call out because there are different proof of stake implementations. So again, I will focus on Ethereum proof of stake in today's video. And we're going to go beyond the sort of three headlines that you hear, like, oh, it's centralized, it's oligopolistic. Like, okay, what does that actually mean? Let's peel the onion back and become better informed of how this actually works, what the pros and cons and trade-offs are relative to proof of work. Because make no mistake, as I alluded to in prior videos, I think a new wave of attack is coming for Bitcoin. We see that reflected in the recent report that the White House put out. We even see that mirrored in some of the Inflation Reduction Act language, which I'm going to break down in a future video. And ultimately, while I'm not condemning a whole sort of group of people, I think there's a lot of people that are advocates of Ethereum who are also advocates of Bitcoin. And frankly, they're very, very different things. But make no mistake, there are some extremely bad actors, especially some of the Ethereum maximalist influencers who are absolutely going to campaign against Bitcoin by demonstrating that, hey, see, you can switch to proof of stake and avoid all this wasteful energy and, work and proof of work, etc. So today is about sharpening our swords. So you are not going to want to miss a thing from today. For those returning to the channel, welcome back, my friends. It is always a pleasure to have you. And for those new to the channel, I welcome you as well. If you like this type of content, I invite you to consider subscribing and join us in our growing merry gang in cyberspace. I cover all manner of Bitcoin-related content, including a whole slew of tutorials on how to acquire Bitcoin, secure it, privacy best practices, running your own node, and more, including deep dives such as today. With all that out of the way, though, let's jump right in, and I want to first start with how Ethereum proof of stake actually works. All right, so again, the merge has happened officially as of the making of this video. I will try and infuse a couple tidbits as I do the editing for this. This will probably go out tomorrow, which is Friday. So there won't be a lot of time that will have passed in order to actually observe much of anything. But again, I'll probably come back and do, I'm sure, videos on this topic in the future. And we should also remember that the Ethereum beacon chain has been operational since December 1, 2020. So there is a lot of work and history and research and testing that has obviously gone through. What I will note is an impressive engineering feat. Again, with that, let's talk about how this actually works. And let's recall and remember, what is the problem that we're trying to actually solve here? And it is in essence to secure a decentralized system, in order to prevent things like double spend attacks and enable a secure, decentralized, functional monetary system. And so proof of work solution to that is rather elegant. If there's ever contention about what version of the chain is the truth, you need simply to look at which version of the chain has the most work embedded in it. That's it. And so there's a very objective and simple truth that anyone can independently reach and conclude on their own without having to kind of trust, any other particular participant or actor on the network. And if you're brand new to Bitcoin, I've done videos in the past that go into how it actually works. But in essence, the expenditure of real world energy in order to conduct this work that enables a miner to place the next block onto the Bitcoin blockchain ensures that we have, again, just a very verifiable, transparent way of assessing which version of the chain is correct. And in a situation in which coins may be attempted to be double spent by some sort of malicious mining actor, it will eventually be the case that one version of those chains will win. You therefore eliminate the double spend, and that is that. So proof of stake says, well, instead of using work or real world energy to secure this decentralized network, can we use capital? Can we lock up capital and essentially achieve the same goal? And so in the case of Ethereum 2.0, the main sort of algorithm at work is something called Gasper, which is a combination of Casper, which helps manage and dictate how checkpoints are established. We will talk about what that is, as well as certain kind of slashing rules that validators face, as well as Ghost, which stands for Greediest Heaviest Observed Subtree, which informs how the specific blocks are chosen within a given epoch. So let's break down how that actually happens, right? So in order to participate in proof of stake consensus on Ethereum, a validator needs to deposit 32 ETH to a staking address. And so right off the bat, I mean, that is quite a lot of money. You know, some may argue, well, you know, ASICs are also expensive if you want to meaningfully contribute hash rate to, you know, proof of work. And there's also a pretty good reason for why that 32 ETH is as high as it is. There's also a limit to how many new validators can join per sort of unit of time. And so that is also something to consider. This also, by the way, doesn't mean that you as an individual need to necessarily have that much. You can use a staking service, such as the one that Coinbase operates, something called Lido. There are many different staking services out there with different flavors of kind of centralization, decentralization, and different trade-offs therein that we will get into a little bit later. And so once a new validator has been accepted, let's take a look at how the actual block production and validation process happens. So you have a series of slots. Each slot is 12 seconds. And each of those slots represents an opportunity for a validator to build and propose a block. So 32 of those slots, which equates to about 6.4 minutes, are grouped into what is called an epoch. And, you know, really every blockchain system has this concept. You could argue that an epoch in Bitcoin is the probabilistic every 10 minutes that a block is created. In that case, you then have a set of 128 validators that are selected by the protocol to form a committee for each of those 6.4 minute epochs. We'll discuss this a little bit, but note the carefully chosen wording here. It says algorithmically chosen. So it is not purely random because it this process, the validator selection process has to be deterministic. That is interesting, and we will come back to that. But in any case, you get this group of validators selected to form a committee, and one validator within that committee is chosen to propose a block per slot. You then have what are called attestations. So the other validators within the committee are providing attestations. There's basically a vote that says, yes, you know, this looks like a well-formed block. The transactions also look well-formed. They follow the rules, etc. And then at the conclusion of each epoch, basically in the first typically block in the next epoch, you have what is called a checkpoint block. And so now the entire network of validators, not just those that were in the committee for the last epoch, vote to lock in a particular checkpoint block. And so how finality is achieved is once you have a particular checkpoint block established, then the next checkpoint block that gets finalized and established, you now have finality on that prior checkpoint block. You also have important features that help prevent malicious behavior, largely around this idea of slashing, or that your stake as a validator can be reduced under different circumstances. So let's take a look at what those circumstances are. As we can see, these are the two Casper commandments, as it were. Basically, this means that you can't vote on two different checkpoints at the same block height. That's kind of part one of this, or you can get your stake slashed and i.e. punished as a validator. You also can't vote to connect two checkpoints that are sort of sandwiched within two other checkpoints. Because it can be the case that a particular expected checkpoint block is skipped in the sense that it's not able to be, you know, finalized. Like, that is okay. The system can continue to move forward. But that second condition of, you know, not being able to connect checkpoints that are sandwiched within two others helps prevent messy chain splits that could otherwise occur as well. So in simplest form, this is a punishment against validators that are trying to mess with consensus in some funky way. And then there is also something called an inactivity link. So that means if you're a validator that's been chosen as this committee and you're failing to provide attestations, you could also get penalized for that lack of activity. Glassnode has started to incorporate some of these metrics into its reporting, and it's generally the case that you see very, very kind of few of these instances happening. So, I mean, it is the case that, again, since the beacon chain has been running since late 2020, it is generally the case that, validators are doing what you would expect and hope them to be doing. So in summary, the economics of a validator are something like the following, right? You have that initial deposit stake of 32 ETH. Again, that is the validator as a whole. As we mentioned, there are all sorts of stake service providers where, you don't need that much ETH to participate in some of the staking rewards. Validator will get outright ejected from the protocol if their balance falls below 16 ETH. And so you can basically earn revenue from new issuance of Ethereum as well as fees. So that's where your balance as a validator increases, or your balance can decrease, as we said, either through the inactivity leak or in a case of slashing. Again, in summary, instead of work being done, it is capital that's being committed. In the case of proof of stake, you have these different slots, one slot per block, that are being grouped together in epochs. You have a committee of validators that's being algorithmically chosen by the protocol. And then in each of those slots that a particular validator is proposing a block, you then have the rest of that committee doing the attestations. And then finally, at the end of each epoch, really the beginning of the next one, you have the checkpoint block where the full validator network looks, and as long as 2/3 of them say, yes, this looks like the right chain history, that checkpoint block basically gets locked in and becomes final once the next checkpoint block has solidified. Now, there can be some interesting things that could happen within a particular epoch in terms of the attestation process. And so that is where the ghost algorithm comes in. And basically what's happening is that it selects the sort of tree branch that has the most attestations on it. So you could have different validators within the committee voting on what they believe to be the right path. And in theory, at least, within the first 6 seconds of that 12-second slot time, you've got the actual production of the block. And then in theory, the last 6 seconds of that 12-second slot time is when the attestations are actually happening. So again, even that is pretty high level. I am certainly not claiming here to be a, technical expert of Ethereum by any means whatsoever, but this should cover the basics at a pretty good level of understanding for us to now be able to move into the next section, which is looking at potential pros. And yes, there are, I think, some pros to this approach versus the cons and potential pitfalls and risks. So let's move on to that next. So in terms of some of the potential benefits, of course, number one on most proponents' list is going to be this idea that, look at all the, we don't have to spend all this wasteful energy. It's better for the environment, blah, 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 blah. I think not only is that misleading, as we will discuss later on, in terms of energy expenditure's critical role in creating this bridge from the sort of informational and real world realms, but it's actually hilariously wrong because, Ethereum proponents are now saying, look at us, look at our tiny carbon footprint, when you have Bitcoin mining that can suck up things like methane and ultimately lead Bitcoin mining to become carbon negative. And I've done a whole video on this recently that I would encourage you to check out, because any Ethereum proponent that says, Ethereum 2.0 is much better for the environment, you can say, well, you literally just got rid of the thing that can actually contribute to bootstrapping renewable energy sources, sucking up methane and, all this other stuff. So that's hilarious in its face. So I want to focus more in today's video on things outside of the kind of energy picture, because again, I've done that prior video. But at the same time, those are very, very important points to note, because a lot of the attack that we're going to see in the very near future is going to be on exactly that point. So let's go into some other potential pros of proof of stake. There are arguments that say that in some cases, proof of stake could have actually stronger security guarantees against things like double spend attacks as well as 51% attacks. So think about the 51% attack. I mean, you'd have to bid up the price of the token so much in order to acquire a 51% stake in the network. So it's also extremely difficult to acquire 51% hash rate in Bitcoin, because you've got the mobilization of actual real world hardware that's needed, And that has a number of attractive properties in its own right. And so while it's hard to do the math and it's very kind of hypothetical and assumption based at this stage, you could envision a scenario in which it is more expensive to acquire 51% stake in a proof of stake system versus 51% of the hash rate in a proof of work system. You could furthermore have the controlling entities of the stake in a proof of stake system just outright not sell, right? Like they just are not selling their tokens. And so it's actually impossible to achieve that 51% if actors were to sort of come together and, not sell their Ethereum, for example. Now, therein lies a big issue as well. As Jason Lowery often calls it, this creates this kind of unimpeachable control authority over the ledger, wherein on the one hand, while it could help prevent against attacks, if it's that 51% that is already in place that starts attacking, then you really have very little recourse as a network participant. The control authority in this case of the ledger is indeed unimpeachable. So that can go both ways in terms of kind of pros and cons. And then given what we just discussed in terms of how some of the different algorithms work, for you to successfully conduct a double spend attack in Ethereum proof of stake, you would need 2/3 of the stake, which could be, that's could be enormous. And again, in some situations could be much more expensive than launching a double spend attack than a proof of work system. You could also argue that this sort of perennial, always on threat of getting your stake slashed is a very strong disincentive to malicious behavior. This would be akin to trying out an attack of some kind on the Bitcoin network and getting all your ASICs just exploded, right? Like ruined, destroyed, as opposed to merely wasting the energy and cost trying to attack the network. Relatedly, you also have this argument that slashing is a more surgical weapon to kind of punish specific bad actors, which can have some merit depending on the circumstance. Although, as we will discuss, that opens up a very kind of strange potential political nature to all of this. And there are likely some potential implications when we think about long-term security budgets. Given the fact that proof of stake validators aren't really spending much real-world energy at all, they in theory need less reward in order to provide their services. Meaning that when you eventually get to a point in the future where maybe there is no new issuance of the token, that these validators are going to be more okay with the transaction fees that remain versus miners which have a much higher threshold for breaking even and running profitably. Again, there's a lot of assumptions built in there, but it is something that I think is interesting to think about. So yes, there are actually, I think, some features here that can help in certain cases and that can make certain types of attacks even more expensive than in a proof of work world. But, obviously there's a but. But let's talk about some of the potential risks, pitfalls, and cons to this approach. All right, so the big one I would start with is the risk of potential centralization and the censorship that may ultimately drive. When you consider the fact that a lot of the existing stake is concentrated in the same geographic jurisdiction. And as I covered in a prior video where I went into the Tornado Cash debacle, again, check that out for more context. In essence, you had a coin mixing tool, privacy tool in the Ethereum world called Tornado Cash, whose associated smart contract address, not even necessarily a person, was sanctioned by OFAC, meaning that it is illegal for any US citizen to interact with that. So that kicked off a lot of discussion. I mean, this was basically a month or two ago, and this kicked off a ton of discussion around, well, what are the implications of this? This is a particular application, but could we actually see censorship at the protocol level in terms of some of these validators, such as Coinbase, that are based in the US and are obviously going to follow US regulator demands? So when you look at the current composition, you start to see where this concern is coming from. So you've got Lido, which is this big gray piece here. You then have Coinbase, which is the kind of light blue. You've got Kraken, Binance, etc. So I mean, number one, you have the top 4 staking services that comprise nearly 60%. And so again, these are regulated entities. That is really not that far from the 2/3 requirement for establishing finality on the network. And we also see this post from Martin Koppelman sort of confirming this, albeit with a small sample. This is out of the last 1,000 blocks. So these are basically in the hours after the merge earlier today, 420 have been built by just Lido and Coinbase. And as you can see, pretty good sample size of votes here. Nearly 77% of folks on Twitter think that is bad. Like, that needs to change. And the sheer size of some of these staking services has been noted even by Ethereum devs as a potential source of real concern. Like, this just unfortunately makes it really easy to hand your protocol over to the government. Now, there's a lot of discussion and sort of campaigning within the Ethereum community to promote solo staking. But again, we know that the requirements for that are quite steep with, 32 ETH, as well as having to run a validator node, which is no small feat. And the question is, like, are you really going to see more solo staking after you have this crackdown in terms of sanctions on Tornado Cash? Do you really think little average Billy with like half an ETH that's currently staked in Coinbase is going to say, you know what, like, I care about censorship resistance, I'm going to go off on my own and somehow come up with the rest of the ETH that I need to go do solo staking? Probably not. You're probably going to have the opposite happen. Now, interestingly enough, it does appear that there was a slight improvement in this regard following Luna, right? Luna, this massive implosion within the world of, broader crypto, but that moved the needle by like 1 or 2 percentage points. And if something that cataclysmic had to happen for 1 to 2 percentage points, I just think it's like, no way that you're going to see this. And so that's a massive concern, is if this trend of stake centralization continues. And I want to be really clear. Again, I don't know the specifics across these different staking services for what the requirement is, but like, you could have a small amount of Ethereum and still participate and receive rewards from staking. So I think the argument of like, there's no way for the little guy to kind of benefit from the system, I think that is a lazy argument, but it is the case that collectively these large staking pools ultimately determine what the true state of the blockchain is. And if they have to censor certain transactions or types of transactions due to regulations, like, that completely takes this kind of credible neutrality assumption that we should have for any decentralized system. Now, in response to this potential threat vector, you have some in the Ethereum community that have said, well, whatever, like, if Coinbase wants to censor transactions, we are going to socially slash their stake. We're going to do a user-activated soft fork, and we're just going to slash the bad actors. It's simple as that, right? But this idea of like, we will slash the bad people, I think is naive at best. Nick Carter puts together this very good article that poses these important questions of what would this look like? Like, would we really slash Coinbase's stake, where you would then have all these innocent people who have contributed Ethereum to the staking service, like they just lose their Ethereum? Is that really what we're going to do? Furthermore, is that really any better than the current system where the US uses its own monetary system as a weapon against anyone that it deems to be its enemy? Can we really claim credible neutrality when social slashing even exists in the first place? Like, there is this tenuous idea that, you could follow all of Casper's slashing rules today only to have your stake slashed tomorrow because some group of, Ethereum elites doesn't like what you're doing. Again, it's not that simple, but if you start to really go down this trail, the fact that even some of these scenarios could be possible is a little bit insane. In the context of a potentially contentious hard fork, this becomes, I think, even scarier, because you would have validators controlling both chains, potentially bullying through slashing for folks on the old chain to switch over to the new. There are a lot of scenarios here that I think could get really messy, really chaotic, really fast, through the existence of this kind of social slashing idea. And so all in all, there's a quote in this article that I think summarizes it pretty well. Stake exposes consensus to government will through regulated financial institutions. It is as simple as that. Now, maybe I'm proven wrong. Maybe we'll actually see a blossoming of, different ways that people can stake in a way that lowers the barrier to entry. There's things like Rocket Pool. So I have no doubt that we will see new tools, new protocols, etc., that attempts to solve this. But I am skeptical, to say the least, that will actually move the needle in the amount that you'd really want it to. Now, the Ethereum advocates at this point will say, well, like, Bitcoin mining pools are very concentrated as well, and they're centralized, blah, 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 blah. But there's a huge difference here, right? If I've got a single ASIC plugged up to a certain mining pool, I can literally within seconds switch my hash rate and point it to a different pool. Literally within seconds. and I don't have to ask anyone or anything for permission to do that. Let's say I currently have some Ethereum staked with Coinbase. The withdrawal code isn't even written yet. That is going to come out with a future, I think they're calling it the Shanghai update, where, it could be anywhere from, months to a year from now, that you'd actually be able to move your stake from one staking provider to another, or potentially to, your sort of own efforts. And even when the withdrawal code is written, and there probably will expedite that given what is unfolded with Tornado Cash and all the related pieces we just discussed, even when that withdrawal code is ready, there's still an exit queue. It's not like you can just do this all at once and kind of flick the switch and boom, you've got your stake switched over. So in this case, you've got a much higher degree of stickiness for stake than you do with hash rate in a proof of work system. So that's one huge kind of block of concern, is this idea of centralized stake and the potential questions that lends to censorship resistance under different scenarios. And related to that, as we really just discussed, are these kind of entrance and exit queues. So you have an exit queue for moving stake. You also have entrance and exit queues for validators entering and exiting the system. And those entrance and exit queues ultimately need to be, guess what, validated, right? So like you could have, in theory, a world in which the existing validators say like, look, we don't want more validators to come on because that dilutes the rewards that we get. So like, let's just censor out any kind of new validators coming in, and there you go. We've blocked new entrants from coming in. Now, of course, I think that's very, very unlikely. Why would they do that? That would send such a negative signal. You'd probably have the price crash and all this sort of stuff. But it is certainly more permissioned than proof of work mining. Additionally, it is not as trust minimized. And this is the whole concept of weak subjectivity. So first, I want to read to you this excerpt from an excellent post that I will link in the description down below, along with some of the different white papers and pieces that I've researched to do this video. But it comes from a guy, Scott Sullivan. It's entitled A Bitcoiner's Guide to Proof of Stake. Very, very good article, but I want to read you this particular piece. It says, now suppose you were starting up a validator node and you were syncing the blockchain for the first time. Just because you observed that certain blocks referenced certain timestamps, how could you be sure that those blocks were really produced at those times? Since block production doesn't require any work, couldn't a malicious group of validators simulate an entirely fake blockchain from day one? And if you saw two competing blockchains, how would you know which is true? So this brings us to our fourth principle behind proof of stake, which is that proof of stake relies on subjective truth. There is simply no objective way to pick between two competing blockchains, and any new nodes to the network must ultimately trust some existing source of truth to resolve any ambiguity. This contrasts significantly with Bitcoin, where the true chain is always the one with the most work. It doesn't matter if 1,000 nodes are telling you chain X. If a single node broadcasts chain Y and it contains more work, then Y is the correct blockchain. A block's header can prove its own worth, completely removing the need for trust. And so this is where the checkpoints come in, right? The checkpoints establish and sort of crystallize history. Now, some will say, well, maybe that's good. Maybe that prevents like super deep reorganization attacks. But again, it's at this cost where you now introduce the need to trust these checkpoints if you're a new validator coming onto the system. Now, Vitalik does address this in more depth in a 2014 piece titled Proof of Stake, How I Learned to Love Weak Subjectivity, where he defines weak subjectivity. You can see at the bottom here, basically, a new node coming onto the network with no knowledge except the protocol definition, the set of all blocks, and 3, this is key, a state from less than n blocks ago that is known to be valid. And so, I don't know, I think you could argue that subjectivity is not a spectrum, right? Like, if there is trust at all, like that is just not trust minimized. So it remains to be seen what the possible implications of that are, but I think it just leaves a bad taste in many people's mouths of like, okay, so you're telling me I just like can't spin up a new validator node without trusting others. There's also just operational risks involved in timekeeping. Many of you have probably seen people call, instead of blockchain, it's the time chain. And that is a much more accurate depiction of what is actually happening here. A blockchain is nothing more than attempting to enable distributed participants to agree on the order of events, i.e. to keep time properly together. And so proof of stake reverses the typical arrow of causality that we see in proof of work. In proof of work, you have block production that happens probabilistically. It might take 10 minutes, it might take 5 minutes, it might take an hour. On average, the difficulty adjustment makes it so that there is a block every 10 minutes on average. Ultimately, the block gets produced, and that then becomes our understanding of time, right? And block height becomes the progression of time. Whereas with proof of stake, it's reversed, right? You have these, 12-second slots in which a block is getting produced. And in a distributed computer system, like, timekeeping is a massive issue. Often cited that the Bitcoin white paper cites, distributed timestamping, timestamping. A lot, and that is because this is one of the central problems to solve here. So we've actually seen issues with this in real world proof of stake situations such as Solana. Like Solana's clock has, been off by quite some margin. And will we see something similar with, Ethereum? It remains to be seen. But that's definitely a risk. And, if you have to keep sort of intervening because your distributed system can't keep time correctly, like that is a problem. I also think there's an argument here that there are just unknown unknowns. Now, it is worth acknowledging the massive amount of research, time. I mean, it has spent years and years, and some really, really smart people that have prepared and implemented this. But it is similarly the case that this switch introduces an enormous amount of additional complexity. The code for proof of work consensus is very brief. The code for proof of stake is like hundreds of thousands of lines long. So you introduce all this additional complexity. It's like, is that really worth what we're getting? Like, what are we getting? And that point is illustrated nicely in this post. Ryan Adams says, the threat of social slashing will keep centralized staking providers from censoring transactions. Imagine telling your depositors all their ETH is gone on the real Ethereum. Imagine the lawsuits. There's a fiduciary responsibility to stop staking if OFAC tells them to censor. And Checkmatey, responds, in proof of work, the free market does this very simply, where miners self-immolate if they burn energy on the wrong chain, right? Like, there is not this need to socially impose this penalty. It is simply implicit in the way that miners and proof of work acts. In order to replace this simple system, it requires hundreds of thousands of lines of code, immense complexity, and introduces politics as the foundation. There's also a softer, kind of more philosophical argument that the validators aren't really expending a real world kind of external resource in order to gain the rewards that they're getting. And that just feels morally wrong, or, it feels wrong in some philosophical sense. And so in summary to all that, while you do have some interesting new features that I do think raises the cost of certain types of attacks, the trade-off is a lot of additional complexity, new centralization risks, especially when you consider the kind of regulated financial institutions that are providing these staking services that many people are using. Less permissionless, it's less trust minimized. As we know, proof of work mining can suck up methane and other greenhouse gases, so it's kind of like that throws the sort of environmental piece out of the equation. If you really lay out the costs and benefits of this change, in my humble opinion, it's a no-brainer. With all that being said, I don't think this is about network security. I don't think this is about, decentralization. I think this is all about number go up, and the narrative that Ethereum is now able to spin and tell about, hey, we're like the world's computer and also ultrasound money because of the triple halving, which by the way is like very, very overblown, right? But we're all these things and we've now cut our emissions, and I do think that is going to very much benefit number go up. And ultimately, I think based on my observations of the community that is what most people sort of care about. That's not to take away from the legitimate actors that are, working and pushing hard on decentralization and censorship resistance, who would rather go down with the ship than have the Ethereum 2.0 protocol be censored at the protocol level. But ultimately, some of the responses I see to actual critiques on things like Twitter suggest to me that, number go up is probably more centrally in folks' minds. And so the final piece I just want to hit on is, therefore, why is proof of work irreplaceable. Cover the pros and cons of proof of stake, again, specific to Ethereum's implementation of proof of stake. There's nuances for other proof of stake implementations, but like, why is proof of work absolutely irreplaceable? Why is difficulty adjusted proof of work the innovation? And it really comes down to timekeeping. I would encourage and urge you to read this thread from Gigi. Failure to understand proof of work is a failure to understand Bitcoin. Is exactly right. And ultimately it's because you can't cheat needing to work, because you can't cheat or create energy. So in proof of stake, there just is no external cost to creating an alternative truth. If you take nothing, literally nothing else away from this entire video, I think that is a nice way to summarize it. So I'm going to say it again. In proof of stake, there is no external cost to creating an alternative truth. Brute force computation is really the only acceptable bridge, because computation requires energy, and energy is real. And so we're basically left having to trust that validators are not going to collude. It is just not as trust minimized as Bitcoin. I'm not saying that Bitcoin is purely trustless either, right? There's still, mining chips and ASICs and supply chain stuff. There's still trust, but it is much more trust minimized than a proof of stake system. And let's be clear, like, there's so many Ethereum advocates I see who are like, there's no voting taking place here. Votes are happening. These are votes. The white papers literally say votes, like they use votes within the language of the white paper. So don't let anyone tell you that this is not a vote. And Vitalik himself even says that proof of work is like adhering to the laws of physics, when proof of stake is like creating our own laws of physics. So I don't know about you, but I would like to be able to trust the laws of physics and not the laws of man. So with all of that, let's go ahead and conclude today's video. All right, so we took a closer look at the Ethereum proof of stake implementation. We talked about how it works, some of the pros of which I do think there are some, but also some of the pitfalls and cons and potential risks that I hope have sharpened your swords and made you more informed and more knowledgeable beyond the couple of bromides of like, it's centralized. Like, well, why? Like, how? Right? Some of the context matters. And I think there is a lot of misinformation on both sides about how proof of work works, about how proof of stake works. So hopefully this video has made you more informed, because trust me, we will need to be able to stand our ground and defend proof of work in the very near future. Now, I genuinely am impressed at the feat of doing this. This is a massive undertaking that's taken, a ton of development effort. I am not of the mind that we should be banning people from like doing things, right? It's just like very, very statist. I don't think we should be clamoring for politicians to regulate unregistered securities. Like, that is so embarrassing if that's your main argument. It's like, oh, it's an unregistered security. Like, that is gross. Get that out of here. We have real, much more thoughtful, better reasons for why proof of stake is inferior to proof of work. And even this video has only really kind of touched the surface of the iceberg. At the end of the day, these are just two very different things for very different purposes. If people want to kind of go and experiment and build different things, on Ethereum, like, absolutely have at it, do your thing. When I think about the core central goal of separating money from state and all the beneficial knock-on effects that could have for human prosperity and civilization, I think this move to proof of stake puts the nail in the coffin for Ethereum to ever be that possible thing. And so maybe in that regard, this is a good thing for Bitcoin, as it often is. But I'm curious to hear, what are your thoughts? Let me know in the comments down below. I feel like I'll get some spicy ones on this one. But I hope you found this valuable and informative. If you did, you already know what to do. Give this video a like. Use the share feature underneath the video. That really does help get this in front of more people. And if you were so enamored by this video that you want to contribute to helping me make more of these videos in the future, you can donate at my Lightning address or Strike address, which I will put up in the ending screen that you will see in just a moment. For now, we'll go ahead and leave things here. As a reminder, every sat counts. And until next time, I'll see you then.